8 children have been killed in one of the deadliest mass shootings in the U.S. in over 2 years. And today, police answered questions, providing a detailed timeline of the incident. So let's break it down. The shooting unfolded early Sunday morning in Shreveport, Louisiana, where police say 32-year-old Shamar Elkins shot 8 children, 7 of them being his own. Officials are calling the incident a domestic violence-related attack tied to a marital separation. Authorities say that all 8 children were found dead with gunshot wounds, and 2 women, including his wife Shaneiqua Elkins, were also shot, but are now hospitalized in critical condition.
There's one thing that almost everyone said after this case. He lost control. But what if that's not true? What if this wasn't a sudden outburst, but a series of actions that had been prepared in advance? Because just a few days before everything happened, that man was still posting photos of himself going to church with his children, still smiling, still showing up like a normal father. He even took his daughter out to eat, just the 2 of them. A moment that, at first glance, anyone would think was love. But looking back, it might not have been just a meal. It might have been the final step before everything began. And the most frightening thing isn't what he did, but this. All the signs had been there for a long time. Everyone saw them, but no one thought it would end like this. If you only look at April 19th, 2026, you'll see a tragedy, a father, a family, and an act that everyone wants to explain with one word: loss of control. But the problem is, that explanation is too easy, too quick, and sometimes it hides something far more disturbing. Because if you rewind just a few days earlier, nothing looked like a man about to snap. You would see a photo, a man standing next to his children, well-dressed, after a church service. He smiles, a very normal smile. The caption reads, "Happy Easter, first time going to church with all my kids." No signs of panic, no signs of things falling apart. And that is exactly where this story starts to feel different. Because people who lose control rarely act that normal right before it happens. That raises another question. If it wasn't a sudden outburst, then what was it? The man in that photo was Shamar Elkins, 31 years old, a former member of the military. Someone who, according to neighbors, was always present in his children's lives. He wasn't the type to disappear, and there was no reason for anyone to suspect him. He was the kind of person who made you not ask questions. And that is what makes everything that happened later harder to accept. But if you look closer, and more importantly, if you place the scattered details side by side, the picture starts to change. About a month before the case, Shamar answered a question on social media. If you could go back, would you want to have these children, but with a different woman? His answer? Hell yeah, I would. If you read that line on its own, it could just be an impulsive comment. But if you put it in context, a married man with multiple children, living in a complicated family situation, then it is no longer a meaningless statement, but a rejection of his own present reality. And that is often the first step when someone begins to detach from the ties they once had. A few days later, Shamar posted another line. Understand to be misunderstood. No explanation, no context. A sentence like that could be philosophical, but it could also be something else. Someone placing himself in the role of being misunderstood. Someone preparing a reason before acting. And then, things started to change more clearly. Not from him, but from his wife, Shaneiqua Elkins. Within less than a week, she made 3 posts. No ambiguity, no going around the point. First post. When a woman replaces you with peace, then everything is already over. Second post. She said directly that she no longer wanted to continue being a wife. She didn't want to share that life anymore. And the third post. I don't feel anything anymore. 3 posts in a matter of days. If you look at them individually, it's a breakup. But when placed next to what happened later, this is no longer just a breakup. It becomes a trigger point. And here is the most important detail that many people miss. Not all cases begin with violence. Some begin when one person decides to leave. And in many situations, that is the most dangerous moment. But still, nothing had happened yet. No warnings, no intervention. Everything unfolded in silence, and no one stepped in. Everything still looked normal. Until April 17th, just 2 days before everything. Shamar took his oldest daughter out to eat, just the two of them. A date between father and daughter. He posted a photo. She sat in the car, a soft caption. If you looked at it at that moment, it was a warm memory. But if you place it on the timeline, after the wife's posts, after the psychological signs, and just 2 days before the case, then this detail no longer stands alone. It becomes part of a sequence of actions, a step taken right before everything began. And that is what makes this story so disturbing. Not because it happened suddenly, but because everything unfolded right in front of everyone, step by step, clear enough to be seen, but not clear enough for anyone to realize how it would end. April 19th, 2026, when the first call was made, it was no longer a warning sign. It became the aftermath. If you only look from the outside, this is not the kind of family that makes people stop and ask questions. Shamar Elkins, 31 years old, living in Shreveport, Louisiana, a former member of the military, had multiple children with different women. The children carried different last names, lived in different homes, but appeared together in the same space when necessary. On social media, this wasn't hidden. On the contrary, it was shown quite clearly. Birthdays, holidays, gatherings, photos posted with all the children standing next to each other. To outsiders, that structure might seem complicated, but not necessarily unusual. Because there was one detail that kept repeating in all of those images. He was always there. Not the kind of father who disappears and only shows up when reminded. Not the kind who creates controversy or makes people uneasy from the beginning. He showed up at the right time, on the right occasions, in the right role. Standing next to his children in the moments that mattered. Enough to create a familiar image, a father who is still present in his children's lives. And in many cases, that alone is enough for others to assume that everything is fine. The relationships around him existed in parallel. Not completely separate, but not fully merged either. Each family had its own space, but there were points where they overlapped. Holidays, gatherings, moments where everyone was placed in the same frame. That created a sense of connection, even though in reality, things were not that simple. To maintain that rhythm, it takes more than random appearances. It requires coordination, control of time, and a way to keep everything looking stable from the outside. Looking at what was presented, there were no signs large enough to raise alarm. No public conflict, no clear warnings. Just a man with multiple children from multiple relationships who still maintained his presence. Everything continued to operate that way. Steady, quiet, without disruption. Photos, posts, scattered moments linking together, forming a familiar flow. But when you look closer, not at the content, but at the way it appeared, a few things don't fully line up. There were times when the children were brought into the same frame, but not consistently. There were moments when he appeared exactly on time, but not earlier, not later. Just enough to keep that image intact. These details weren't big enough to draw attention, but they weren't completely invisible either. A response slightly out of rhythm somewhere. A post appearing at a time that didn't quite fit. A distance beginning to form from the wife's side, but not yet named. All of those things existed, but no one stopped to piece them together. Because when viewed as a whole, the picture still held its original shape. A present father, a functioning family, a life that showed no clear sign of heading toward a breaking point. That surface layer is what made everything behind it harder to see. Not because it was hidden, but because it was right there, inside what everyone had already been looking at. Nothing changed all at once. It shifted slowly, slow enough that no one felt the need to stop. Most of those changes didn't happen directly in front of anyone, but lived inside what was posted every day, drifting past among hundreds of other pieces of content. In March, on Shamar's personal page, a question was shared again. If you could go back, the same children, but with a different woman, would you choose it again? The answer was left right below, short and direct. Yes. No further explanation, no edits, no deletion. Read on its own, it feels like an impulsive reaction, a response that didn't require much thought. But when placed at the time it appeared, before what happened afterward, it no longer passes by that easily. A few days later, another line was posted. No image, no context, just 4 words. Understand to be misunderstood. The words weren't directed at anyone specific, nor tied to any clear event, but they created a slight distance, just enough for the reader to sense that something was drifting away from normal. During that same period, from Shaneiqua's side, the rhythm changed faster and more clearly. At the beginning of April, she posted a short line about how when a woman chooses peace instead of a person, everything is already over. 2 days later, a longer post appeared, this time without implication. She stated directly that she no longer wanted to continue the role of a wife, no longer wanted to share that space, no longer wanted to maintain that life. There was no emotional outburst, no direct accusation, just a decision expressed in different ways. 3 days after that, a final line appeared. I don't feel anything anymore. 3 posts in less than a week, each moving one step forward, but none of them standing alone. During that time, from Shamar's side, there was no public response directed at those lines. No arguments, no denial, no explanation. The content on his page continued in the familiar way. Images of his children, everyday moments, things not directly related to what was happening. From the outside, everything kept its shape. But when you place the 2 sides next to each other, the imbalance becomes clearer. Not through a specific event, but through the speed of change. One side was slowing down, the other continued as usual. On April 5th, the church photo appeared, all the children standing together in a frame that rarely held all of them at once. Everything was arranged neatly, positions clear, timing appropriate. If viewed on its own, it was just a family moment, nothing more. But it appeared right after the posts from the wife, when the distance had already started to show more clearly. 2 days after that, nothing notable happened on the surface. No signs of conflict, no sudden change. Then came April 17th, when he took his oldest daughter out to eat, just the 2 of them. A photo in the car, food in hand, a light caption, nothing unusual. Taken on its own, this detail looks like hundreds of other moments between a father and a child. But when placed after everything that had unfolded in the previous week, after the posts, after the distance that had already been shown, it no longer stands completely separate from the context. There were no lines stating clearly what was happening, no action large enough to make others step in. Everything was just small pieces, appearing at the right time, unnoticed when standing alone, but when arranged in order, they no longer feel disconnected. No one called them signs. No one stopped to piece them together. Everything continued, still looking normal, until the morning of April 19th, when everything that had appeared before no longer existed as scattered fragments. The morning of April 19th, 2026 began like any other day, at least on the surface. There were no warnings issued beforehand, no public signs suggesting that things were about to go out of control. But the chain of events that day did not unfold in a single space, and it did not stop after one action. It moved from one place to another, following a sequence that only becomes clear in hindsight. The first point identified was a house on Harrison Street, where Shaneiqua was at that time. Based on what was pieced together from statements in the scene, Shamar arrived there first. There is not much information about the conversation between the 2 before the gunshots, only that she was shot at that location, with severe injuries. A teenager inside the house managed to escape by climbing onto the roof and jumping down, injured but still alive. He was the first to leave that space. The incident did not stop there. After leaving Harrison Street, Shamar moved to another location, not far away, on West 79th Street, where the children were. This is where most of what followed was discovered. When law enforcement arrived, they were not dealing with a single scene. There were multiple areas to check, multiple positions to identify, and the number of victims meant the response no longer followed a standard process. Inside the house, 7 children were found. Outside, near the back area by the roof, Another child was discovered. All of them had died. 7 of them were Shamar's biological children. The other was a relative in the family. Another woman was also shot at this location and was taken to the hospital in critical condition. What happened there did not last long, but the consequences spread across multiple spaces at once. After that, Shamar left the area and continued moving. A vehicle was taken near the scene, and a pursuit began shortly after. The route extended from Shreveport to Bossier City, crossing administrative boundaries in a short period of time. When police made contact, the incident ended there. Shamar was shot and was confirmed dead at the scene. At this point, what happened that morning stretched across multiple locations: Harrison Street, where Shaneiqua was shot, West 79th Street, where the children were found, and the final point of the pursuit. Investigative teams had to work simultaneously across multiple scenes, each providing part of the information, each holding a segment of the sequence of events. When all the pieces are placed back in the correct order, the time between each point is not long. There are no clear pauses between the actions, no signs of interruption. Each step follows the one before it in a single direction. From Harrison Street to West 79th, then out of the area, and finally ending along the pursuit route, all of it took place within the same morning. For those who arrived afterward, this was not an easy scene to approach. Not because of the scale, but because of how everything was arranged across time. An event that began in one place, but whose consequences were found in multiple others. Those working the scene had to handle not only physical evidence, but also reconstruct the sequence, identify the starting point, the transitions, and the end. By that point, there were no more posts, no more short lines, no more everyday images. What had appeared before remained exactly where it was, unchanged, not removed. Only their meaning had changed, once placed beside what happened that morning. After that morning, everything stopped. But it did not end in a way that was easy to understand. The neighborhood on West 79th no longer held its old rhythm. People came and went, stopping in front of the house, setting down small items, leaving in silence. No one stayed for long, but no one completely stepped away from the story either. The names of the children began to be spoken, one by one, attached to their ages, attached to things that should have still been ahead of them. In the hospital, Shaneiqua was still being treated. There were no more posts from her. The lines from before remained exactly where they were, not deleted, not edited, just there, the way they had appeared, but no longer read in the same way. The question from March was still on Shamar's page. The short answer remained unchanged. The line, "understand to be misunderstood," was still there. No new context added, no explanation. What once passed by quickly now stood still. The photo from April 5th, all the children standing together in front of the church, was still being shared again. Nothing in that image had changed. The same smiles, the same positions, the same carefully arranged moment. Only the viewer had changed the way they looked at it. The entire morning of April 19th had been pieced together in sequence. The locations, the time gaps, the movements. A continuous chain with no clear breaks. But what happened before that did not have the same structure. It was scattered, small, and easy to overlook. There were no lines stating clearly what would happen. No action large enough to force others to step in. Just details appearing at the right time, then fading from attention. Until they were placed next to each other, and no longer felt separate. After the case, many people went back to read what had been posted. Not to find new information, but to understand what had already been there. But once everything had happened, the way of reading changed too. A sentence once overlooked could now hold attention longer. An image once seen as normal could no longer keep its original meaning. There were no conclusions written in those lines. No complete answer waiting inside any single detail. Only one thing became clearer in hindsight. Everything did not begin that morning. And if a sequence can exist in a scattered state for that long, then the remaining question is not about what happened, but whether, at that time, anyone ever saw the whole picture, or if everything only ever existed as separate pieces. On April 19, 2026, in the city of Shreveport, Louisiana, police received a call related to a family incident. The initial information did not show the true scale of what was unfolding. Only when units arrived at the scene did the picture begin to emerge, not in a single location, but spread across multiple places. The name of the person involved was later identified as Shamar Elkins, 31 years old, a former member of the United States military who had lived in the area for many years. He had multiple children with different women. The children lived in different locations, but remained connected through gatherings, holidays, and family activities documented on social media. Before the incident occurred, there were no public reports indicating a clear risk. There was no record of serious violence mentioned as a direct warning sign. The image presented outwardly still followed a familiar structure. A man present in his children's lives, participating in important moments, and maintaining a routine that appeared stable. However, in the weeks leading up to April 19th, certain details began to appear. Social media posts from both sides, statements not directed at any specific event, but appearing more frequently and more clearly. A question answered publicly. A few lines without clear context. A series of posts from the wife showing a shift in personal decisions. These details existed independently. There was no clear connection when viewed individually. No specific action attached to turn them into warnings. They passed by along with other content, drawing no particular attention at the time. During the same period, family-oriented images were still being posted. A photo at church, where all the children appeared in the same frame. A private meal between Shamar and his oldest daughter, recorded as an everyday moment. These details did not contradict the overall image, but reinforced it, keeping the larger picture unchanged. By the morning of April 19th, the sequence of events began at a house on Harrison Street, where Shaneiqua, Shamar's wife, was present. Based on what was later determined, Shamar arrived at this location first. A shooting occurred there. Shaneiqua was shot and taken to the hospital in critical condition. A teenager inside the house escaped by climbing onto the roof and jumping down, injured but alive. After leaving Harrison Street, Shamar moved to another house on West 79th Street where the children were. This is where most of the aftermath was discovered. When authorities arrived, they found 7 children inside the house and 1 more in the back area. All had died. 7 were Shamar's biological children, and 1 was a relative. Another woman was also shot at this location and was taken to the hospital. In total, that morning, 10 people were shot across multiple locations, including 8 child victims. After leaving the West 79th area, Shamar continued moving. A vehicle was taken near the scene, and a pursuit began shortly after. The route extended from Shreveport to the Bossier City area. When police made contact and ordered him to stop, the incident ended with Shamar being shot and pronounced dead at the scene. The entire sequence that morning did not occur in one place, but across multiple locations. Harrison Street, where it began, West 79th Street, where the victims were found, and the pursuit route where it ended. Investigative teams had to work simultaneously across multiple scenes, each providing part of the information, each holding a segment of the sequence of actions. When the data was reconstructed in time, the gaps between events were short. There were no clear pauses between points. Each action followed the previous one, moving in a single direction from beginning to end within the same morning. After the incident, the surrounding area became a gathering point for residents, media, and authorities. The victims were identified along with their ages. This information was officially released during the investigation. The community began organizing memorials, placing flowers and items at the locations where the events occurred. In the hospital, the injured continued to receive treatment. Authorities proceeded with the investigation to clarify the full sequence, establish the timeline, and complete the case file. At the same time, what had been posted earlier on social media remained unchanged. No content was altered. No new lines were added afterward. Posts, images, and responses stayed in their original positions. When read again after the incident, these details no longer carried the same meaning. A response once overlooked could be reconsidered. A post that lacked context could be placed differently in the timeline. An image once seen as ordinary could no longer stand on its own. No single detail could explain the entire event. No single moment could be identified as the true beginning. What existed before was not arranged in a clear structure, but appeared scattered over time. Only when all the pieces are placed together, in the correct order, does the connection between them become visible. But by then, the entire sequence had already ended. The case in Shreveport on April 19, 2026, was recorded as one of the most serious incidents in the area in many years, not only because of the number of victims, but because of how it unfolded, across multiple locations within a short period of time, and with elements that had existed beforehand without creating clear warnings. In the end, what remains is not only at the scene or in the investigation file, but also in how those earlier details are re-examined. The posts, the words, the moments that once passed unnoticed, when placed next to the final outcome, no longer stand alone.